Hi guys, today I'm here to show you all the books that I read during November. I was writing for a lot of November. I was working on my second book, Read with Pride, which is the sequel to my first book, The Paper and Heart Society, and usually when I'm writing I either don't read a lot or I read loads. There doesn't really seem to be an in-between, and November was one of those months when I read a lot, and I also read some books that I know I'm going to treasure forever. Some I've been meaning to read for a long time that are really iconic, and others that had been on my TBR for a while or were by authors that you've been recommending to me a lot and thought that I should read. So I suppose I would describe my November reading as very concentrated on the books that I knew I was going to enjoy. So the first book that I read during November was 84 Charing Cross Road by Helena Hanff, and this edition includes two books. The first is 84 Charing Cross Road and the other is The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street. Both are memoirs and they are told in letter form about an American woman who starts a correspondence with a bookseller from London on Charing Cross Road, which is traditionally where lots of books are sold in London. The first book details the correspondence between Helena and Frank, who is the bookseller, and then the second book is a diary that Helena kept when she went to London for the first time after 84 Charing Cross Road was published, and she became quite well known for writing it. I really enjoyed this. It was a very quick read, but I don't think that that distracted from it in any way, even though there wasn't a lot to it. I found that it was so heartwarming and sweet that it kept me thinking about it long after I had turned the last page. If you have enjoyed books like the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, then this is one that I think you will also enjoy. I found them quite similar. Both are post-war novels, and this actually is drawn from real life, so there is slightly more of an authenticity to it. The letters actually took place or actually sent knowing that these were real people that were involved in this story, and even though because of that it's not very plot heavy, it is the emotional side of this book that is its appealing side. So I would highly recommend this for any book lover, and also I think it's a good one for this time of year too. At the end of October, around Halloween, I started reading Dracula by Bram Stoker, which is one that I've really been looking forward to talking about. I was kind of hesitant going into this because it is such a famous novel with so many ideas surrounding it that people just know. It's like you're born knowing about Dracula. It's just something that is seeped into our popular culture these days and really is our idea of what a vampire is. So there was some nerves going into it. I wasn't sure if I would love it, but I also wasn't too worried if I didn't love it, because really the reason I read it was to read it rather than to enjoy it. I wanted to read it for its cultural significance and also to know that I had read it. So I knew that it wasn't exactly going to be my favourite book ever, and I was right. It's not my favourite book. I found that it did drag in places, but I also loved the narrative. I love how groundbreaking this book was, and I wish that I could go back in time and read it when it was first published, because I feel like I would have had a stronger reaction to it then. For those of you who might have notions about what Dracula is about but don't know for sure, the book opens up with a man called Jonathan Harker going to Transylvania to advise a man called Count Dracula on buying a property in London. But once he gets there, he realises that things aren't quite as they seem, and I loved this part of the book because it really draws on Gothic tropes and conventions. Your typical Gothic castle, which I loved. I loved this setting and how we don't usually see this kind of things, particularly in the books that I tend to read. And once Jonathan gets more acquainted with Dracula and his habits, such as him not being awake in the day, not seeming to eat anything ever, and also these strange goings on in the castle, he finds himself caught up in this world that he really wishes he wasn't caught up in. There are parts of the book that had me closing my eyes, not wanting to read the pages because I found them very creepy, very gothic, which I think those are my favourite elements of the book, but there were also elements I just didn't quite get because I think a contemporary reader would have felt this strong reaction, but I didn't quite. Dracula is told in diary entries from Jonathan's perspective, but then is also told in letter format, in other journals from other characters. It goes back and forth between Transylvania, London, Whitby, which I really loved reading about as well. And I'm not certain which character was my favourite to read about. I really liked Mina, and I also really liked Lucy. And I feel like the female characters in this book get quite bad stick for being as they are, but I also thought they were quite well formed for Victorian women, and whilst they aren't the strongest characters in the book, and Mina definitely didn't live up to her full potential, I also found that I liked them and wanted to read more about them and what they said about what it was like to be a woman at this time. I think the downside to this book was the ending, which I found quite rushed. You build up to this point where something really big is going to happen, and then I thought it was a bit of a letdown. So I wish that it had been slightly more dramatic at the end. I wish that it had maybe been tied up better in some places whilst also being left open in others. I just feel like you spend the whole book on this journey with these characters expecting this big explosion, and it was just a slightly smaller explosion than I would have hoped for, so that was the downside, but it is an absolute classic and one that I think everybody should read at some point during your reading lives. I really enjoyed it. It's one that I probably will reread again, but I wouldn't say it's one of my favourite books ever. An author I've wanted to read for a while is Georgette Hare, and I decided to start with Arabella, which is basically all my Jane Austen dreams come true. I don't know about you, but I've read most of Jane Austen's novels now, and I'm always looking for something that emulates the same feelings that I have when I read one of Jane Austen's novels. And even though I feel like Georgette Hare is slightly inferior because she isn't Jane Austen, and you know she's not Jane Austen, I still felt similar emotions when I was reading Arabella. When I started it, I thought it might take me ages to read because it was quite heavy going to begin with, but once you get a few chapters in, you really learn her writing style, and then I found that I raced through it and read it, and I think a day and a half. I just couldn't put this down, and there was something very endearing about it, something that just immersed you in this Regency world, because this is about a gorgeous young woman in Regency England called Arabella, who is a country parson's daughter, and she is brought into London society where she draws the attention of the most popular man in Regency London, but also is lying about who she is. She says that she is from wealth, she is not, and so everyone is intrigued about her background and where she comes from, but she knows that she is telling one massive lie, and so it felt very tropey in some ways. You know when you read like really good fan fiction and you have that satisfying feeling of reading something full of these amazing tropes? I felt like I had this with Georgette Hare, but also felt like I was reading something that wouldn't be amiss if it was written during the early 1800s. So it was this perfect mix of a very satisfying book with really well researched world building, with intimate details about the lives of the people who lived in it, and for me that was the perfect combination. Georgette Hare basically began the historical romance and Regency romance genres, and for that reason I can't wait to read more of her books. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next, but I enjoyed this so much that I feel like I'm going to create a reserve of her books on my shelf so that whenever I need them, whenever I need a really comforting read, I can go to them and I know that I'm safe with her writing. For ages now, lots of you have been convincing me to to read some Russian literature, in particular Leo Tolstoy. Now, I have been reading Anna Karenina this year very slowly, I have to admit, and I do want to finish it sometime soon because I do think it is a fantastic book, but I thought that I would go for some other Leo Tolstoy writing in the meantime, and I decided to read How Much Land Does a Man Need, which is published by Penguin Littleback Classics. This contains two short stories which read as fables. They are How Much Land Does a Man Need and also What Men Live By, and I loved both of these. I loved the moral nature to them, I loved how much they made me think. I particularly loved How Much Land Does a Man Need, but What Men Live By was also great. Just for me, How Much Land Does a Man Need was the more solid story and also did make me think more, because I found one of the downsides to What Men Live By is that it begins with quotations from the Bible which tell you the moral of the story, when actually I would have quite liked to have got to the end and figured it out. I didn't quite want to be told before the book has even begun what the moral of the story is, and so for me I think it would have been far more enriching without that, but I still really liked it. So How Much Land Does a Man Need is a story about possessions and how once you have more possessions you will then want more. So it centres around a man who says that if he was given more land he wouldn't live more extravagantly, but then once he is given more land he does, and he always wants more. And I particularly liked the look at how that increases, how once you have one parcel of land you want to increase it, how then once you are given the opportunity you will just have no end to what you want. And so it did really make me think in that sense. And James Joyce thought that it was the world's greatest story, and I can honestly see why he thought that. For me it's obviously not my favourite book, but I do think there is something very great about this story. I think it is reminiscent of things like Goethe's Faust and also novels like that which are bargains with the devil. It has biblical allusions too, so I think it brings together everything that is great about moral stories, and I think that was also one of the reasons that I loved it more than the other story, which is difficult to describe what it's about because I feel like it's one you just have to read for yourself. But it is a story about love and why we love. It was reminiscent of things like The Good Samaritan, and it's all about the reasons and motivations behind why we do the things that we do and why we act in the way that we do. And Leo Tolstoy basically believes that the reason we should do the things that we do is because we have a love for our fellow people, and love should be the driving force behind our actions. So I really loved both of these, and I'd love to read more of Leo Tolstoy's short stories, and I'd love to read similar stuff to this because I think it really whetted my appetite for it. Also now it's given me a greater reason to finally finish Anna Karenina, so maybe at the beginning of 2020 I shall do that. Second to last, we have a book that I didn't expect to love as much as I did, and it is The Diary of a Nobody, which is written by George Grossmith and illustrated by his brother Whedon Grossmith. This is diary extracts from a nobody living around the 1880s in London, and it is really looking at middle class life, that lower middle class life in London where everything was kind of changing, where all these new trends were coming into fashion, where this man is doing his job every day but also is having these hilarious things happen to him along the way. I must admit to laughing quite a few times at this book. There is something about Victorian humour that I really love and just appeals to my sense of humour. There's lots of clever wordplay, lots of things that the main character finds funny but nobody else around him does. So I was laughing, and I don't think I should have been laughing at some of the things, but I just love that clever wordplay, and it was done so well that I couldn't help thinking to myself as I was reading it, why are more people not talking about this book? I don't necessarily think the sense of humour would appeal to everyone. I feel like it's one of those things that might be lost in translation as well, but I loved it, and so I feel like this is a book I'm going to be talking about a lot and will be rereading because I just I just want to experience it all again, to read something that is so full of light, harmless humour. In places you have things that just don't make sense to a modern reader, but I feel like it was packed full of stuff that does as well, and sense of humour doesn't really change that much over time, so I loved it. I just loved this book, and I loved how it made me feel. I like that when you read some darker books or things that are really heavy, you can find something like this that just lightens up your whole world. And I also loved how much the illustrations added to the story. They were definitely not unnecessary. You could read it without, but I think that the story was enhanced by the illustration, particularly when you're thinking about things like clothing. What were people wearing? What were they looking like? It really helps you to ground yourself in the story more. I will say though that I have the Wordsworth Classics edition, and I found that some of the illustrations were slightly misplaced. I would have put them earlier on or later on to match where the text was referring to the things in the pictures. So I don't know if that would be an issue if you were reading other editions, but this one wasn't brilliant and also got kind of damaged, so that was a bit disappointing. But I really loved this. We'll be rereading it soon, and I'm sure it won't be the last time you hear about it on my channel. We are saving the best book for last. I cannot believe that I read this book and just fell in love with it instantly. I read the first page and I knew then that it was going to be one of my new favourite books, and I've saved it for very late in the year too. I wish that I'd read it earlier so I could have read more by this author, but I won't leave you guessing who it is. This book is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, and I'm now obsessed with Edith Wharton, so don't expect me to shut up about her anytime soon, because in the next few months I'm sure I'm going to be reading most of her books, because I am totally in love. The Age of Innocence is set in 1870s New York, this very decadent society that is reminiscent of things like The Great Gatsby, although it's set well before The Great Gatsby. And I actually think one of the really interesting things about this book is that even though it's set in the 1870s, it was written in the 1920s, in particular in 1920 after the First World War. During the First World War, Edith Wharton lived in Paris, and she particularly helped with the war effort. And so The Age of Innocence is about changing societies. It is a commentary on 1870s New York, which had changed after the American Civil War, but Edith Wharton is writing it after the First World War in a society that had changed because of that. So she's basically commenting on two things at once. Edith Wharton came from a very privileged background. The phrase "keeping up with the Joneses" is based on her family, and that really comes across in the novel because she does know these very intricate details about the furniture, about the way that people lived, about these strict social rules that people in New York society had to conform to. But in the midst of this you have two characters. You have Countess Ellen Olenska, who has been married to a European count but comes to New York after the breakdown of her marriage. She has fled Europe to move back to New York. And you also have our main character, Newland Archer, who has been brought up in New York society and is this typical example of a young male who has been brought up in it. He conforms to all the rules, he does as he is told, but when he meets Ellen again, he starts to realise that there might be more to society than just this bubble he's been living in. It's also complicated by the fact that Newland is engaged to be married to Ellen's cousin, May, and whilst he loves her, May is this figure of conformity, whilst Ellen is the opposite of that. I think I might make a separate video on this because I have so much to talk about. In particular, I'd love to look in more detail about the role of the narrator in the novel and how that sheds light on May as a character. May is a character who does conform, who is exactly what she should be, but also, is she like that, or does she have these inner thoughts too that we don't get to see because we as a reader are so stuck in Newland's head and how he sees the world. Something that's becoming increasingly important to me as a reader now when I read classics is the ending. I think an ending can make or break a novel, and as I said earlier in this video, I didn't feel satisfied by the ending of Dracula because I thought it was very rushed. It didn't feed into what had been built up throughout the novel. But The Age of Innocence is a perfect example of how an ending can make or break the book, because I thought it was utter perfection. I felt that it was satisfying, it was conclusive, gave me all the answers I needed, was also continuing the story that had happened throughout the book. So whilst not everything was tied up, it gave me enough questions that made me continue the story in my mind, but also gave a satisfying ending to what had happened, and also didn't give into the fully happy ending that a reader might want or expect. And sometimes as a reader, I feel like it's best to be left with that feeling of wanting, to want more from the book, and feel like everything is so neatly tied up that that's it, you don't need to know anymore, and you feel like the writer has slightly sold themselves out for the happy ending that people think that they want, but isn't necessarily what they need. So I thought that The Age of Innocence was utter perfection, extremely decadent, extremely revealing of the society at the time, and also the society that Edith Wharton was writing in. And I insist, if there is one novel that you should read next year, it is The Age of Innocence, which I'm sure will blow you all away. I fell head over heels in love, and now I need even more of Edith Wharton's writing in my life. So I really hope you enjoyed this insight into what I read during November. I'd love to know in the comments what you read during the month, what was your favourite book and also your least favourite book, and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!